Today, my guest is Vanessa M. Reiser. She is an LCSW and author of the book Narcissistic Abuse, a therapist's guide to identifying, escaping, and healing from toxic and manipulative people. The Dr. Romney calls the book a validating and compassionate reference that provides survivors and clinicians with the vocabulary for what happens in these relationships and the tools to manage what can feel like a hopeless situation. Mark Vicente, who is an author, speaker, and an award-winning writer, director, and producer, says that Vanessa, also known as Joan of Arc, looks at the bigger picture of mind control and uses real-world examples to explain her point. She shares relatable stories about how narcissists manipulate any relationship, whether it's two people, a small group, or even hundreds. With that being said, I hope you enjoy today's interview with Vanessa M. Reiser. And one of your favorite things to talk about in that book are cults and the cult dynamic with it. What got you interested in that?
When I started to talk to Mark Vicente from the NXIVM cult, and I began to see the connections between being in a cult of one, a cult of a few, or a cult of many, it sort of clicked. I had this aha moment that I was in a cult, and that many people are in these tiny mini cults of one in an interpersonal relationship. And so the book is designed to fuse the concepts of narcissistic abuse and cult abuse.
What do most people not understand about cults?
Most people think that a cult happens somewhere in a faraway land, in the middle of nowhere. There's some kind of a guru that's, peddling some kind of religious experience. Really what's happening in cultic situations, there's an abusive person at the helm, and they are always a narcissist, a sociopath, or a psychopath. And they're using mind control over their victims. If it's just one person in a marriage or a relationship, if it's a family dynamic, there's always these cultic families all around us all the time. And then we see this with bigger organizations that are somewhat like what we envision in a cult, where there's maybe a gaggle of people or more. And then we see this in very large political realms where there are millions of people that are following a cult leader. So, this is what it is that it's basically mind control. And I think most people don't understand that all of us can fall for that. It really doesn't have anything to do with your level of education. It happens very slowly. It's like, a slow burn. It doesn't happen, like in an overt way. They are master manipulators. So slowly you sort of lose yourself in these experiences, and you could start to subscribe to a narrative that is totally false. You're being isolated from information. You have blinders on. Your abuser is keeping you from getting data and information outside of whatever they're peddling to you. And all of a sudden you start to subscribe to this new reality. So I think most people think that a cult is a situation that happens in a faraway land. The thing that's really interesting about Mark's cult, the NXIVM cult, was that it happened in New York, and it happened very recently. It wasn't, in a faraway land. Well, certainly not for me as a New Yorker, but it was also very recent. Keith Raniere from the NXIVM cult was sentenced in 2021. So, and he was famously branding women with his initials or having others do so. So the idea that it happened somewhere far away is it's not reality. We really are dealing with cultic situations all throughout your neighborhoods. There are, somebody's at the helm in a hierarchical experience where there's maybe an authoritarian figure in that family dynamic that is manipulating the family members. And so that's a cult, right? And that's it's a little bit hard for people to sort of bring this into their understanding that is a cult. And so that's what my book is designed to shine a light on.
And how do these cults, do they rope people in?
So what they'll do in the luring phase is really no different than what a narcissist does in the love bombing phase. They are pretty well synonymous. So, they'll promise you things, maybe enlightenment, if you're thinking of a sort of a traditional cult. They will bribe you. They will future fake you. They will be manipulative and maybe, cry fake tears. They will isolate you. And then all of a sudden, yeah, you're lured into this environment. They can be particularly charming. And so we see, cult leaders as sometimes like these, like, quote unquote gurus. So they seem to be all knowing. But in that phase, it's very much a love bombing thing. So they're going to potentially buy you things, gift you things, flood you with compliments, do sort of insidious things like maybe violate your personal space, get too close to you, and, kind of seduce you in some ways. So we see this with cults, but we see it's the same as love bombing in a relationship.
Right. And what are the red flags of someone who's getting sucked into this dynamic? I think part of what makes it difficult is it's a group of people, not just one person. Sometimes you have a whole group of flying monkeys and enablers come in, and they're all love bombing new recruits, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. The biggest red flags would be if you see somebody who it has inconsistent statements. So somebody who their words don't align with their actions. Oftentimes they're like promising like a great deal of, big and fancy things, and then nothing ever sort of comes to fruition. And it's not just in groups. It's the same, it's just like, it's really no different in a one-on-one versus a 1-on-1 million. They do the same thing. They gaslight, they lie, they tend to be addicts. So these are people who are always addicted to attention. So they don't necessarily have like a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, but they tend to also have those. They tend to be impulsive, controlling. And in the gaslighting, when they're deflecting or being passive aggressive in their communication, again, very insidious. It's not sort of necessarily the sort of quintessential version of gaslighting, which is like, I didn't say that, or something like that. It can be confusing dialogue, word salad, where you find yourself in these circular conversations and you're kind of like misfiring, like that doesn't make sense, this kind of experience. They behave differently in public versus how they do behind closed doors. So somebody who is, really, really kind to the neighbor, but then really is unkind in the home. They don't have empathy. I think this is like the big sort of glaring red flag. They can fake it, but you might notice if somebody passes away or is sick, how they really are not able to show up and hold space and understand what's being experienced by the neurotypical people who are managing that. They tend to be superficial. So they're really kind of into fame. They are into fancy, shiny things. So the superficiality I hear a lot from clients is like a huge trend. They're into like all the bells and whistles and Gucci and stuff like this. But there's a long, long recipe of characteristics that narcissists possess, and that is exactly what a cult leader does. It's a cult is always led by one of them.
Mm. And then the term you use in the book is empathy not included, and I thought that was a great way to put it.
Yeah, yeah. They know how to fake empathy. They know like kind of how to, and some of them are actually really, really good at this, right? They're like really good actors. So, the tears will come and all of that. But that is a really important thing to look for, is do their actions line up with that? So are they actually showing up at the funeral? Are they managing to care for a sick loved one? They tend to live in a fantasy world that is somewhat delusional. So they don't understand reality. And, all of us are fallible. We all get sick. We all are not going to live forever. And so this fracturing of that fantasy, it seems to be particularly difficult for them to understand. As a matter of fact, they don't really generally go to the doctor too much, or the dentist. They tend to be like, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing wrong. How could anything be wrong with me? I'm perfect. This kind of ridiculousness. But so they have like an aversion to reality, especially if somebody even has the flu or something like this.
Right. And you would call it magical thinking. Magical thinking, fantasy thinking. They really do love that. And that is why they gravitate to those cult type situations too.
Yeah, they have a God complex. Some of them actually are somewhat delusional around how superior they think they are to others. And so, yeah, that kind of hierarchy is very strange. They're not really good at collaborating and having a collective and sharing ideas. It has to be their ideas. They are the all-knowing.
Okay. And where do you fall on this part of it? There's I guess, kind of a debate where are narcissists, do they really feel superior and grandiose? Are they covering up for insecurity? Or can it be a combination of both? Or it all depends on the specific narcissist?
I think they probably vacillate between both feeling totally inept and that false identity of being completely godlike. I don't think that they can manage the reality, which is that they are fallible and, just creatures who put their pants on one leg at a time. I don't think this is something that they can manage. So they probably go back and forth. And if they should feel uncomfortable in the reality of who they are, they probably will just lean into, fake it till you make it or something like this, like, kind of fluff out their feathers and let's just see what happens. And it works for them. They tend to be very successful and they tend to do very well and climb the corporate ladder and fool a lot of people in a lot of environments. So they have a ton of data that supports that they will be successful in their endeavors, unfortunately, because a lot of people don't understand what to look for. And even when you do, it's really hard to absolutely say, this person is has NPD.
Right. And I think our society right now, it rewards narcissistic tendencies. It rewards the people that want to get attention and admiration at all costs. And people, all it takes is views and eyeballs on you. And that helps your business. It helps you climb to the top.
Yeah. When you're in a capitalistic environment, it is highly individualistic and people are celebrated for whatever seems to be like cutthroat, me, I'm gonna do this and screw you. So we don't have a lot of that collective as much, I think, anymore. I think social media has really impacted that. I mean, there's obviously good and bad about it, but certainly concerning. It feels like we are trending in a direction that is less empathetic.
Oh, absolutely. I think even social media in general, it's detached a little bit. And I think that contributes. It contributes to people's overall lack of empathy too, regardless of their whatever genetic inborn lack of empathy they have. I think our society can also contribute to it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we need to really get back into like the Sesame Street of it all and being nice to one another and sharing and kind of really cultivating that in our young people. I think there's just there's a movement away from that, unfortunately. Hopefully, everything is cyclical, so hopefully, empathy becomes cute again.
That's a good way to put it. And you had also mentioned in the book narcissists are egocentric. What does that mean?
So they are basically they are going against what they actually believe. So basically, it's difficult for them to recognize problems in themselves. These are people that don't have insight. So somebody who is able to understand, and be insightful is the opposite. This is not how they behave. So they are actually, forgive me, they are egocentric and dystonic. I'm sorry, dystonic is the one they are. So they are not insightful. They are not able to look inside of themselves.
Right. And that's where their lack of collaboration comes from too. They're not going to problem solve. They're not going to try to solve conflicts with you. Often they'll just make more.
Yeah. So they can't collaborate. And that's one of the main reasons why we don't see studies on them, is because it's not like narcissists are coming into session and saying like, I want to work on this. So we almost have no data to pull from. There are some studies being done in prisons, etc., but for the most part, we don't have a ton of data on record about narcissists because of this exact reason. They are not insightful. They're not like, hey, you know what? I want to work on this. Most of the people who come into my practice who are, wanting to work on narcissistic traits are generally mandated. So they are being told by either, a law guardian, or sometimes in their marital experience, their spouse is saying you have to go in
Yep.
and try to work on this, but they generally are not eager to change. They kind of like the way they are because in their minds they're winning. Empathy to them looks like something that like losers would possess. So they don't really want to be quote unquote losing. They want to be winning. And so they don't generally want to change. They think empathy is like stupid. What a waste of time, get over it, this kind of perspective. So, we don't see a lot of them eager to, learn empathy or understand what others are experiencing,
Right.
unfortunately.
And that's why they don't even start the process to change. If they don't think they have an issue, they won't admit they have an issue. And then that process never starts. And I think the other thing for therapists to know is if they're going to lie, it's very difficult to help them anyway. How are you going to help someone that is lying to you and you're not getting the full story? You just can't help someone that's going to lie.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're very manipulative. So most of the time they'll come into session potentially with a partner and they're eager to just have the therapist, find their story to be, more believable or something like this. And that's why most people don't really benefit from doing couples counseling with a narcissist.
Oh, absolutely. And another part of your book I really liked was it is angled towards helping therapists with this too. What do you see as things other therapists might struggle with or things that they could learn more and better about narcissism?
Yeah, a lot of people come to me and they actually say, I had a therapist who didn't get it and it actually was more damaging, or, the narcissist was able to manipulate my therapist. And so they don't, I don't think, understand all of the insidious behaviors of psychological and mental abuse. They can understand physical violence. They'll put their mind around that. But as it relates to how traumatizing psychological abuse can be for someone, I'm not sure that therapists are really there yet. Obviously, there are a lot and there are seemingly growing numbers, which is very exciting because Dr. Ramani and others are putting out continuing education credits for this now, which is really great for therapists. But yeah, I think that's just starting to develop. I noticed after I started doing this work, there was a major upkick. It seems like therapists have now really gotten on board, which is very exciting for the population at large, so they can find validation and a safe space to unload what they've experienced and get support around. Because I think the worst thing that happens for people who go through this is to not be believed. I think it's horrifying, especially if you're dealing with somebody who's particularly Machiavellian or sociopathic, because those people will do things like, listen to your playlist. And then I had a client tell me this is an interesting one. Listen to your playlist and then start humming the songs in the kitchen that you were just listening to. And then you're beginning, it's almost like a version of gaslighting, right? You begin to think like, how did you know all of my songs? And then tell other family members that you're crazy, that you're maybe schizophrenic. And then other family members come in and they, bring you into an institution and institutionalize you but they will do this for sport. So they will really find ways, very insidious ways, to set up scenarios where it's very precarious. You may find yourself in jail. You may find yourself being poisoned by other family members. And so sociopaths really get a kick. They get a real charge out of doing things that are particularly evil or seemingly
Right.
evil. And so it's really important that therapists can understand that this isn't like something that's happening on a Netflix documentary. This is a real thing that happens all around us all the time. These people are everywhere and really, really dangerous. So hopefully that will, create a movement and more environments where people will be believed.
And this is something that I see too. I see some therapists will try to minimize it. They'll say, oh, narcissism is so rare. People are using that word too much. It's become a buzzword. It's lost all meaning. And again, I don't know if they're well intended or not when they say that, but I don't think it's really helpful when they say that either. But what would you say to those therapists that say that?
Just refer the client to a therapist who gets it. I have really wonderful therapists that I mean, I had to probably be like 4 over the last 5 years that have referred clients to me. And I always make it a point to say to them, like, good on you for doing that, because you could have taken this on and created more damage. And I really respect you for referring out, because this is such a niche thing. And like, if you don't get it, it can create far more damage. So it's easy enough for them to say, you know what, I don't specialize in this. I'm not sure about this, because to your point, like, a lot of things, the biggest thing I hear that therapists mess up is they'll say, well, we have to figure out why you keep attracting this. That's the number one thing, right? It's like, we have to figure out, what about you? Like, you're codependent, or what are you doing wrong? How is this happening to you? And they make it about, where it really has nothing to do with that.
And that is also what they do too. You're right, where they'll say, we're not going to focus on this other person's behavior. We're just going to focus on you. And we're going to focus on you. Oh, why does this person bother you so much? What is it about when they say this that really upsets you? And I think some of that stuff can be helpful down the line, but the timing of this is super important. When someone's being gaslit and abused, that's not the message they need to hear right away. It's no, like, they need to know this is abuse. Like, this is not good. At the very least, it's disrespect. And understanding that and having a therapist come in there and say, yeah, that's not good. Instead of, oh, why is this bothering you?
Right.
Well, how are you gonna process your emotions with this? And they just put it all on them instantly. And to me, it's annoying to even hear that.
Yeah, I know. And it takes like a few years, quite honestly, for people to really process what they've gone through. I don't think it's quick. So that kind of conversation would be far down the line, kind of after all of this has been unpacked. And that is a long journey, because what I find most of my clients do is they're still putting puzzle pieces together. Like a year later, they're like, oh my God, I just remembered this happened and that meant this. And now I understand why this occurred, because there was an agenda there and this was supposed to do this. And they're always putting these little puzzle pieces together. And it takes a long time to paint that picture fully. I mean, I still have like flashbacks and things that I remember. And I'm like, oh, that's what that fool was up to. Oh, like, I mean, it's still every now and again, I'm like, wow, all of these years later, there's like still things that click. And I think it is a long journey. So I would say probably and people may not want to hear this, but I would say on average, if you're in therapy, you're looking at like 2 years of like trying to manage what you went through. If you don't do therapy, I think it's going to be double that. So I think it's important to find a therapist that really gets it, or a life coach. I learned so much stuff from, I would say the biggest beacons in my life and the greatest teachers were life coaches, quite honestly, because you don't have to have a degree like I have to understand this. I learned more from people who didn't have degrees than anybody, just in my personal, circle. So you just have to find somebody who gets it. You have to lock arms with the people who understand.
And here's a question about it too. In your curriculum, when you were going to school, do they teach about narcissism? What is it like there? Or do they just not even talk about it much?
No, I really did not get it much on this. I went to the University of Southern California, which is a formidable institution, and very little was discussed on personality disorders, and even just on diagnosing. It was like not a lot of that. And even in my internship and the beginning, when I became a social worker in New York, you're sort of thrown to the lions, and you're kind of like, okay. And I was definitely working in an outpatient mental health clinic, and it was like chaos. And you had to do the best that you could do to sort of help people all the time. But it was kind of like drinking out of like a fire hydrant. There was so much going on, and you did the best you could, and you learned along the way and all of that. But in terms of really understanding this, no, definitely not. I had a little bit of an understanding of domestic violence, but at that time I was, really thinking of it as physical. And this was something that I had to experience firsthand for me to really understand what it was. And now through my clients, they've sort of even given me more data, because there wasn't a ton to study anyway.
Right.
As I mentioned, but now I have all of this information because they're sort of reflecting all of this stuff and saying, wow, this is what I experienced. I'm going, oh my God, like almost like they have a playbook, right? So part of that is in my book in terms of what their characteristics are, but my clients really taught me so much.
Yeah, and that is the cool thing about coaching and having clients is it helps us too. It helps us learn, and we can probably look back on our journey and say, "Oh yeah, that they remind you of things that happened to you."
That's
And
exactly right.
I think overall too, there's just a big difference between reading about something in a book versus seeing it in real life and having someone talk to you about, "Oh, this is what this person is doing." There can be a little bit of a disconnect there, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, it's people come to me because they know I went through it. I mean, that's the bottom line. And I know with Dr. Nadine, people go to her because they know she went through it, and others. And I think they feel safe. They don't feel like they're going to be judged. They don't feel like um, they have to sort of get too much into the story. They're kind of like, listen, I already know what this is, Vanessa. Like, I studied this shit. Like, I know what it is. Can we kind of fix this trauma that I've experienced? And then we go into what I think a lot of life coaches may not have in terms of clinical stuff, is like the cognitive behavioral therapy and the dialectical behavioral therapy and other modalities where we can really work to shift cognition and build up self-esteem and all of that. But sometimes they don't understand what they've gone through. Sometimes they come to me and they're still in the relationship and they are saying, I want couples counseling and can't we fix this and all of that. So obviously varying degrees, but I have learned so much from them, and it's been a gift. And I did, thank all of my clients in the forward of my book, because I was like, the stories I hear, particularly with the family court, I don't know how these characters have survived some of the horror stories that I've heard as it relates to the family court. And I did not co-parent with a narcissist, and I feel like that is just a different level of hell.
Yeah, because there is no contact in a situation like that. It's limited, but it's still very difficult. And I think the other great point you made there was just not having to convince the therapist, yes, this is what narcissism is, this is what I'm dealing with. Not having to convince them really removes a step in the process. Okay, they get it. They
Yeah.
get it. I'm not going to have to convince them this is a real thing. They're on my page, and now we can try to work with it from there.
Yeah, you're right. It really is exhausting to try to peddle this story to somebody who doesn't understand it. It'll actually make you feel crazy.
Yeah, and it is invalidating to even have to explain it that much to them too, because they're going to say, "Oh, you sure it was this? Are you sure it was that? Maybe it was you. Maybe it was that." And it's like, and that's if you've been abused, that's not what you need to hear coming to a therapist. Not then.
No. I've heard some stories, along the way. I had one client tell me that her son was poisoning her. And I knew it was true because, like Manson and other cult leaders and narcissists, they don't necessarily do the dirty work. They have minions that are going to be very busy doing their dirty work. So obviously the toxic co-parent had, created a narrative with this child, and the child became a minion. And I had to tell her, you cannot really ever tell anybody what you just told me, because nobody's going to believe you, and you are going to find yourself in a world of shit. I believe you. I know it happened. I absolutely could see how this could come to be. First of all, I think it would be very hard to make that up. But yeah, these are the kinds of stories that I hear. And so they really are so afraid, like, if I tell this to the wrong person, am I going to, be in a rubber room somewhere? It's very, very, very hard for normal people who don't understand this to believe a story like that. And so,
Right.
yeah, that's my clients find me because they're like, they know that I'm gonna hold space for something like that.
Yeah, it's definitely a different thing than regular dysfunctional relationships. There's a big difference between narcissistic abuse in a cult-like scenario versus just a regular, not compatible, a little bit unhealthy. Big difference.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Another thing you said in the book there too that stood out to me, the difference between someone getting comfortable and the mask slipping. Because some people would say, well, everyone has a honeymoon period, and then when the honeymoon period's over, you get comfortable. But how is it different when a narcissist mask slips than that?
I think every relationship has the honeymoon phase. So everybody's got their, best foot forward. Everybody is paying attention to the first impression, and how they're going to show up in the relationship. And then over time, people just become comfortable. And actually, there's tons of data around how this is extremely healthy for people. And that in the beginning stages of a relationship, they're actually kind of dopamined up, maybe not thinking so clearly, right? The hormones are going, things are kind of actually, maybe a little bit destabilized. Actually, the body doesn't necessarily think these are great things. So levels are increased. And then over time, they sort of dissipate and you kind of get into a rhythm. And actually, that's where human beings actually thrive. They do much better without those high level of dopamine, sort of the cortisol of it, everything's kind of flowing around. But in a toxic relationship, the mask slipping is that the person who pretended to be, Prince Charming or Princess Charming is now going to reveal to you over time who they really are. And it's kind of interesting because they do it somewhat purposefully in that they are going to be gauging what you'll tolerate. So the mask, they kind of, they may rage at you or be passive aggressive or do something. And then they're going to watch how you handle that. Oh, so you were able to tolerate that? Let me turn up the dial. How about this? And so over time, it becomes increasingly more treacherous for people in these relationships. And in that, either there's going to ultimately be physical abuse or you just sort of lose your soul. It's such an energy grab. They're like sycophants. So all of a sudden you have nothing left. You sort of wake up from the stupor and there's no career, there's no friends, there's no home, there's no hobbies, So like, as I mentioned earlier, it's a slow burn, but that's what they do. They're turning up this dial because they're watching to see, oh, you tolerated that. Let's see what you'll tolerate next. And it just goes like that over time.
I've even heard people say they wish it would get physical because that way at least it would be more obvious to them about what's going on. But it's the emotional, mental abuse that's much more tricky to detect.
Yeah, I've said this before and I really stand by that. And I hate that I have to say this and I think this way. But there are times where I have clients where I just think, if he would just get physical, that could potentially free her from this because it's this idea that time will be wasted, which is such a precious commodity. So, we're looking at 10 years of your life, that could have been saved. And I certainly would rather experience an acute trauma than go through something like 20 years of, death by 1,000 cuts.
Right. And related to that is the wounded soothing cycle. What is that?
So what the narcissist does is they will create a problem and then fix the problem. And then you become they become like this idol because they are the person who is your fixer. They fix everything. So they may set up a flight for you. You're going to go see your girlfriend. I'm going to send you on this holiday. It's going to be amazing. Then behind the scenes, cancel the flight, tell you your flight got canceled. I don't know what happened. And then rebook the flight and be the hero. So they will do this over time. So kind of like lift you up, kick you down, lift you up, kick you down. and you become kind of interested in them as your savior, and they will be the fixer, and they seemingly become the only person that can help you out of those scenarios, mostly because you're isolated. No one else is around you who could tolerate what you've been enduring, which is sort of this up and down roller coaster ride in your relationship. Your friends really may not want to hear about this shit anymore. Maybe they don't like him. Maybe your family members have been trying to tell you, get away, all of this. But yeah, so there's this up and down where they kind of love bomb, devalue, love bomb, devalue, love bomb, devalue, and you're just up, down, up, down, up, down. So it's always a wound and soothe.
Right. And that's the intermittent rewards effect too that makes it more addicting. The same reason gambling's addicting, because you don't know when the payout's going to be.
Yeah, you become addicted to that love bombing phase or the makeup session because you just really want it to be okay. You don't want to have to deal with the passive aggressive stuff, the silent treatment, the name calling, whatever their, kind of mode is, but you just want it to stop. And you think, oh, if I can just tell them again what they need to be doing, or if I can just explain to them how hurtful this is, or if I can just show them the right way, they will, do that good thing. But when you don't understand that they like the way they are, that they get a kick from creating chaos, they will take good or bad attention. They just need the attention. When you begin to really understand that all of it is on purpose, I think it's really hard for people to process that their brains are working differently. They don't think like a neurotypical person thinks. They don't think that way. They just don't think that way. Like, so I have to spend so much time with my clients getting them to understand that, because it's like, but I don't understand. Why do they? I'm like, this is why their brain is corrupt. Just to wickedly oversimplify, their brain doesn't work the same way your brain works.
Right. And that is something I hear a lot of people struggle with. They're trying to understand, why did they do this? Why would they do that? Why would they say this if they loved me or didn't love me, or fill in the blank? And them trying to figure it out really just gets them going in circles, and around they go, but then they keep on winding up in the same place.
Yeah, it's very hard to process that. I mean, we kind of look at human beings and think, okay, this human being looks like a human being. It looks like a creature like me, and it looks like it's going to do similar things. And then when you begin to see that people really do think differently, and manage that reality, then you tend to do better. I remember when I first started working as a social worker and I had to work with my first schizophrenic, I remember it was extremely intriguing, interesting, challenging, to understand that they were hearing voices. And then over time, you began to work with, I started to work with multiple schizophrenics, and I began to see that this wasn't something that was happening like that wasn't real. It was real, this idea that brain was fractured and was operating differently. Because I'm a clinician, I could then put my mind around it because I had seen this, sort of. And similarly, we see this with autism. We see that there are certain things that are happening with brains that are just different. So if you could just conceptualize it that way, that the brain is going to work different with different people, it should help you to develop an understanding that that's reality. Different brains are working differently.
Sure. And I think something that friends and family might struggle to understand: why do people defend their abusers?
I think for them what happens is you become so codependent. You become so enmeshed with this creature by design. They've sort of made you an extension of them. They mirror you. You can't really even understand, like, am I the narcissist? It's very hard to sort of understand what's even happening after a while. And so to unhand the reality that you've been living is to almost like unbecome who you are or something. It's like you would almost be disemboweled. There would be like a death of self in a lot of ways. We saw this with Nancy Saltzman from the Nexium cult. She could not conceptualize that her deity, Keith Raniere, was not, this beloved creature that she believed him to be. And to the extent that she had to go to prison, she just followed him, even though everyone was railing at her. Listen, everything you're hearing is true. he is the monster that we're trying to tell you he is. She just had to double down, triple down. She could not manage it because for her, it was going to be to unhand who she had become. And that's hard to do, right? It's hard for you to just let go of yourself. Your entire life and ego is attached to this reality that he's created.
Mm.
And so it is extremely difficult for people to unhand themselves. It's almost like cutting off your arm and running. It's like very challenging to do. And I think Nancy Saltzman is like the quintessential version of like how we see somebody. As a matter of fact, the way to get somebody out of a cult is really not to tell them, hey, you're in a cult, get out of there, because then they're going to double down. It's through a lot of other hard work, like, staying connected to them and trying to remind them of who they were prior. But, the more you say, you're in a cult, buddy, and like, they're like, fuck you, because they're too attached to that narrative. It's almost impossible. And you could understand that because it's like, it's almost to free fall, right? Like, oh my God, so everything I've been doing this whole time is garbage. Like, that's a very challenging thing.
It's almost a religious conversion, really. It's similar to they're in a religion of this cult and they're subscribed to the distorted version of reality. And like you said, to backtrack that's very difficult for people. And we're seeing that in all walks of life right now, honestly. We see that in politics, we see that in other spiritual groups, religious groups. It's wild to see unfold in front of our eyes.
Yeah. I think the trick is going to be, we have to start teaching children and youth and kids how to be independent thinkers. We need to celebrate when they draw outside the lines. We need to celebrate when they question authority. We need to celebrate when they don't follow like a sheep, right? So this idea that like, telling children, all of these things that we think are traditional things, and you have to act according to, what we think and follow us. And I think we really need to cultivate in our children and celebrate when they question authority, when they push back, when they don't follow us. Like there was something happened with my son, and I was leaning on him too much. I think I had a bad breakup, and I was like, "Oh, Anthony, what's going on?" And he was like, "I'm not getting involved in this. I'm not your therapist." And I was like, I did something right.
There you go. How about that?
Yeah. Because I was like, you know what? Like, yeah, I can't. I love that he has that disposition where he's just like, tell everybody, like, kiss off. Like, this is what I'm doing. And it's very exciting to see him just he will push back. He's like, this is not, do not try to feed me anything. I'm good.
That's pretty impressive to hear. I mean, how did you instill that in him?
I think probably I didn't give him a ton of like information. I think I would share my perspective. And I think his father was very similar. We were kind of like lifting him up, and we would just celebrate his, victories and want him to do well and stuff like that. And as a collective, I think we just wanted him to be okay and happy and, like that kind of stuff. But, and he's also an only child. So I think he's pretty sturdy in his own thought. Like, I think he's in his head. He tends to be like a little bit of an introvert. Like, I think the way he thinks, he had to learn probably early on how to self-soothe a lot because he didn't have like, any characters to bang ideas around with other than his parents and his friends. He has great friends, but I think he just has that disposition. I think we need to cultivate in children, like they have to learn on their own and they have to fall down and figure things out. And, I think a lot of people are even well-intentioned, not that they're necessarily trying to, build a cult, but I think they are really stuck in traditional behaviors. They may want to build like a mini me, like, well, I played football, so you're going to play football. And I went to this college, so you're going to go that because it's tradition or some of this shit. And I just like, all of that stuff is really, really wonky for me. I can't do any groupthink scenarios. Like, I get very triggered by religion, and I cannot really get too caught up in like groupthink when there's too many people and they're following things. I get like, whoa, I got to get out of there, and I'll just kind of shift away. But like, yeah, so I think we really need to cultivate that in our young people. It's like, let them discover and push back and let them become their own selves.
And I think what happens also, social media contributes to these echo chambers where I think people, what they do is they gravitate to people that think like they do, and then they keep to that bubble, and then they get more maybe extreme within that bubble. And people might think differently, but then they just go to a different bubble where people think like them. And the ideas just don't seem to get challenged too much, or people get really ridiculed if they ever push back. And then the group turns on them. And we see this everywhere. We see this all in many different groups online. Do you have any ideas on how to combat something like that?
Oh God, that's really hard. I I think you have to get away from it, unfortunately, because it's very hard to get those people to understand what they're witnessing. Um, I'm not sure entirely how you can protect yourself. I mean, I suppose you can try to make complaints to certain organizations about that, but generally speaking, it's hard to get a group to sort of unthink what they're thinking.
I mean, that is the $1 million question right now. I don't think anyone has the answer to it really, or they would be doing it. But
Yeah.
all people do is they try to teach people, like you said, to be an independent thinker, to maybe work on not being afraid to disagree with a majority. Because that is a thing, right? Where people, if a majority of people think something, it takes courage to disagree with the majority when you're in that group. It doesn't take much courage to just go along with it. Oh, that's normal, right? Oh, my people think like this. I'm going to go along with it. But to disagree and be true to what you're actually thinking and feeling about the situation, that's courage to me, being able to do that.
Yeah, and we really need some courage in this world right now. We need people to start to push back against what they know are lies. We need major soldiers and courageous characters. I mean, I think it's so important what you're talking about. A lot of the times when somebody comes to me and they've just extricated themselves from a cult, they have such a hard time because they are wickedly outnumbered. Some of them have to leave behind their own families, their own children in some of these religious organizations. And it's very, very hard for them to process. It's like, how can I be right if everyone else believes this? I must be the problem. Okay. So, like, they really can't even understand that they could be right because they're outnumbered. The numbers are really scary. So yeah, we really kind of need to sort of speak truth to power. We need to be okay with being the black sheep. We need to be okay with being the truth tellers and the outliers and kind of the ones that are seeing things accurately. And we need to start doing that far more.
And you just touched on some of this, but what are the biggest barriers to exiting either a narcissistic relationship or a cult? What do you see get in the way for people?
I think cognitive dissonance is a big deal. So they vacillate between the two versions of the deity, right? So they'll be like, oh, but there's this side to them that's really lovely, and then they kind of really struggle with this confusion between the Jekyll and Hyde of it. Who are they really? Are they the good person or are they the bad version? And so they really struggle with cognitive dissonance. And then the other thing that they tend to really struggle with is when you actually do leave a relationship, that is when the abuse really starts. That is when you are going to now fully get the wrath. So, like, some of them will try to leave. I think specifically when it comes to domestic abuse, I think it's 7 times it takes for people to leave a relationship like that before they're successful. But then that's when the pain really begins in post-separation abuse. We saw this in cults with Leah Remini when she tried to leave Scientology. She was, death threats, and they would just stalk her and just kind of give her absolute hell. And we see this in interpersonal relationships through the court systems, the family court specifically, so judicial system through legal abuse. They will try to just sap you of your resources through, vexatious litigation over and over and over and over again. They will try to take your children from you, your careers, everything that they think you really care about, they will target. And so it's really after the relationship is over that the misery of it even just starts, believe it or not. And so
Mm.
people saying like, why don't you just leave? It's like, are you kidding? That is where, you know, Lucifer lives, is the leaving of it all. So yeah, we see this with cults. We see this with domestic abuse and intimate relationships, but they are confused in the first place. And then when they finally get out, it's even worse anyway.
How can therapists better support people going through post-separation abuse?
That's a good one. I think what I do for my clients